Joel, we're talking about the book of Exodus. Is this really a separate book? How do we fit this into the whole story of the Pentateuch?
Right. The short answer, the easy answer is, there is not really, nor has there ever been, a book of Exodus, right, that anyone thought of as an independent literary unit.
It never exists on a separate scroll.
On a separate scroll, it exists. As a separate book, not. Right? It is a volume. It is one volume of the 5-volume work that is the Pentateuch, or the Torah. And it really can't exist by itself. The story picks up as a continuation of the end of Genesis and continues on into Leviticus and following. I don't think anyone ever considered the story beginning with, as it does, the death of Joseph.
But mind you, when Joseph goes off the scene, you get an entirely new cast of characters. You know, in Genesis, we've been talking about family stories, about a couple of patriarchs. Now you get into Exodus, you've got a whole people suddenly. And it feels different.
I think it should feel different. What we have here with the patriarchs on the one hand and the Exodus story on the other, I think what we have here are two originally separate and probably competing notions of how it is that Israel has claim to the territory in Canaan that it now occupies. In Genesis, in the stories of the patriarchs, we have this family that wanders from place to place and builds altars and buries its dead and lays claim to parts of the land. And that seems to be some original story of how it was, God promised us this land and we have been living here ever since. The Exodus, on the other hand, looks to be a completely different tradition in which the people is taken out of Egypt and brought by God into this land that they now occupy, including the whole notion of the conquest. At some very early stage, I think these two stories were brought together into a single continuous narrative. But the tension that you were sensing between the different characters and the different style of story on the one hand and the other, I think that's probably representative of, reflective of those different origins traditions.
But let me complicate the story a little bit first of all. This would work very nicely if we just had one clean story in Genesis and another clean story in Exodus, and you could say that somebody then put in the story of Joseph to tie them both together. Now, the problem is, as you well know, that when you get into Exodus, we're hopping from one strand to another.
That's right. That's the other problem with saying that Exodus is a book, a literary unit on its own, is that it is, in fact, like Genesis and like the rest of the Pentateuch, composed of multiple different strands, different stories that have been interwoven together. They start at the beginning of Genesis and run all the way to the end of Deuteronomy. We call them by what now seem like rather odd names because they're just letters. We call them J and E and P are the ones that are present in the book of Exodus. J stands for Yahwist, which is to say this is the document and the author who used the divine name Yahweh all the way back at the beginning of Genesis. Right? This is the author who says that people have been calling Yahweh by his name since the beginning. E is the Elohist, who claims precisely the opposite, that in fact, for a long time, we referred to God just as Elohim until, in fact, Exodus 3, when God reveals his true name to Moses. And P, the third source that we deal with, stands for priestly, which is simply descriptive of the interests of this particular author, who seems to have a real focus on the cult and the priesthood and is responsible for the entire book of Leviticus with all of its gory priestly details.
So we have then more or less 3 editions of this story.
That's right.
Each with its own slant. Now, but what about the original story? Where was it all put together in the first case?
I think the best we can say is that it probably happened in a gradual, probably pre-literary oral stage. That is, as the nation of Israel grows and develops, and as different people come in and become part of it, and as they intermarry and their family stories get tied together, this epic sort of gradually develops over a number of probably centuries, incorporating native patriarchal stories, perhaps some stories that came from outside of Israel, like the Exodus, which certainly has its origin outside of Israel, like the story of Sinai, right? The revelation at a mountain that is certainly not in Israel. Right? As these stories get brought together, I think they get tied together into an overarching epic that then each of those sources becomes a different literary manifestation of.
Now, we had a famous predecessor at Yale named Brevard Childs, who would have said, well, so what? Granted, well, I think he would have still acknowledged that all of these were woven together, but he'd say that what really matters for us is the final story. What do we gain by pulling them apart?
Well, from a purely historical angle, that is, if we want to know something about the community that produced the text, right? As we pull back the curtain, so to speak, and we get at these original source documents that made up the final form that we now read, we're seeing in them aspects of ancient Israelites' biblical thoughts. And they are so different. I mean, this is not as if we have one simple theological agreement and then they all have slightly different instantiations of it. There are major theological differences. And I think it's very valuable to recognize that even in ancient Israel, in what we think of as the biblical world, there were multiple, diverse, quite different views of Israel's history, God's relationship with Israel, and these sorts of things.
You know, for Christians, I think a good analogy is the four Gospels. Fortunately, somebody actually took those apart. Well, it didn't take them apart because they were composed separately, but kept them apart. And so people can see them. But now, when I was young, it was quite popular to have versions of the Gospels that just fused them all and wove them into one story. And people had been doing that since antiquity.
That's right.
The problem with the book of Exodus is that this got done very early, and that's what we actually have in the Bible.
That's right.
Is a kind of diatessaron.
That's exactly
a combination of these four different strands.
That's right. So, I mean, being able to see that there are different stories not only is interesting historically, but it also actually allows us to grapple with some of the problems in the text. Right? We tend to, as you say, we tend to do is sort of fuse the text into a clean narrative for ourselves. Right? We tend to, when we tell the story in our various communities, when we learn the stories as children, right? We learn them in this very clean, easy form. When you actually try and read the text, you run up against all sorts of bumps and, in fact, places where you sort of have to stop short and say, I don't understand that story. I don't understand what it just said. And rather than forcing ourselves into, tying ourselves into knots, we can appeal to the history of the composition of the text as a way of explaining, how these contradictions and problems came to be.
Now, there's another kind of bump that we run up against. You're probably familiar with the old joke of the kid who comes home from school and tells his parents how he heard this wonderful story, how a group of Israelites were escaping from Egypt and were trapped at the sea, and God sent in the Israeli Air Force to bomb the Egyptians. And the father said, "Is that what they told you?" And the kid says, "No, but if I told it to you the way it's written in the book, nobody would believe it." So, you've got a few tall stories in this book.
We do have a few tall stories in this book. And actually, I think this is something that I would ask you. How much of the book can we trust? Right? How much can we say is historically accurate, and what does it matter, one way or the other?
Yeah, I figure there must have been something. It's not the kind of story that people make up about themselves typically. It's not a glorious beginning. So I figure there were people in ancient Israel who had been slaves in the land of Egypt and got out of there somewhere.
How many people?
600,000,
do you think?
Probably scattered groups from time to time, but certainly not the kind of mass exodus that we have in the book. Now, this is a topic that's been explored by archaeologists now for a generation. The people who settled in Canaan didn't have a whole lot of Egyptian crockery or anything that they brought with them. If they despoiled the Egyptians, as they say in the story, they must have lost it all in the wilderness somewhere. And it hasn't showed up. It hasn't been found by the archaeologists. And, you know, as we'll see as we're going through the book, it's hard to see, you know, how they would have even gotten to some of the places, or why they would have gone to some of the places on their way out. Right. And so, you know, I think we have to settle for the fact that what we've got here is essentially a legend. I'd say legend maybe more than a myth, because I think there is a little historical nucleus in it. Mm-hmm. And now, does that matter? I always think it matters. You know, if you think of an issue in modern history, take the Holocaust, for example, as an easy example that everybody gets worked up about. Does it matter whether it happened? Sure it does. It has a huge, it makes a different emotional impact if you think it happened. So the question with the Exodus then is going to be, you know, what happened? And I think it doesn't have to have happened in exactly the same way. Good stories often get exaggerated. Mm-hmm. So, you know, a myth is not untrue. It's just a different mode of telling the story. But we do have to worry a little bit about what kind of reality is underlying these stories.
But you think it's important that something did happen. Do you think that also about stories like the flood?
No, I mean, it's also important that something didn't happen every now and then. It's just important to get clear on that, to get clear on what kind of story we're dealing with. I think, you know, it will make a difference whether there's some kind of historical reality there or not. Now, I mean, I think everybody would pretty much agree, other than rank fundamentalists, that the first 11 chapters, say, of Genesis are myth, you know, where you don't really have any historical residue. If it were conclusively demonstrated that no Israelite ever came out of Egypt, well, then we just have to read the story in a somewhat different way. I don't think there is any merit in finding a historical cairn where there wasn't one. And we'll see as we go through the story, there are several cases where people have wasted enormous amounts of energy trying to do that. But I do think it makes a difference. Really, the only historical cairn here, I would say, is that there is a memory of slavery. Mm-hmm. And this is something that will get used a lot in the laws later on. Remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. Right. And even if you weren't personally, remember that somebody was.
Right. And we do have good archaeological evidence that there were slaves in Egypt who were Semitic, perhaps Canaanite, and we actually have documentation that slaves did sometimes leave.
Yeah.
And as we'll talk about, Moses does have a good Egyptian name. So there are plenty of reasons to think that, as you say, something happened.
There's some root of it there.
Something happened.
Yeah.